She had built a $1 billion empire from nothing, but she couldn't survive 3 days with her own parents. Victoria Hayes had defeated rivals, outlasted critics, and rebuilt herself after an accident that should have destroyed her. She had done all of it alone, on her terms, with no one to answer to. But tonight, staring at her phone with her mother's voice still ringing in her ears, the most powerful woman in the room was quietly falling apart. She needed a boyfriend. She needed one by Friday, and she was willing to pay $20,000 to get one. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story can travel. Now, let's begin. The penthouse smelled like fresh lilies and expensive nothing. That was how Victoria Hayes had always decorated, with things that looked beautiful and cost a great deal and ultimately meant very little. Calla lilies in a crystal vase on the kitchen island, a $4,000 throw blanket folded on the couch she almost never sat on. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle, like a painting she'd bought but never really looked at anymore. It was 11:14 on a Tuesday night, and she was sitting in her wheelchair at the edge of the living room, phone in her lap, the call with her mother still open even though neither of them had spoken in almost a minute. "Victoria." Her mother's voice came through the speaker again, careful and hopeful in that particular way that made Victoria's jaw tighten. "Your father and I just want to meet him. That's all. 3 days. You always say we don't visit enough, so here we are. We're visiting." "I know you're visiting, Mom. I confirmed the reservation at the lake house last week." "I know you confirmed the reservation. I'm talking about Daniel." There it was. Daniel. The man Victoria had invented 4 months ago during a weak moment. A Sunday brunch with her parents over video call when her mother had looked at her with that particular expression, soft and worried, and full of the kind of pity that made Victoria want to hang up and never call back. She'd said the first name that came to her. "There's someone. His name is Daniel. It's new, nothing serious, you wouldn't know him." And then she'd spent the last 4 months building Daniel into something almost believable. A man who was thoughtful and patient, who didn't mind her schedule, who understood her world. Her mother had started asking about Daniel the way she once asked about Victoria's quarterly reports, with genuine investment. "He's looking forward to it," Victoria said. The lie came out clean and automatic, which was maybe the most disturbing part. "Good," her mother said. "We land Thursday morning. Tell Daniel we're bringing his favorite wine, that Bordeaux you mentioned he likes." Victoria had no memory of mentioning a favorite wine. She probably had. She'd built Daniel so carefully over these 4 months, filling in details when her mother asked, keeping them consistent, never making him too perfect or too interesting. Just present, just there in a way Victoria herself hadn't been able to manage since the accident. "I'll tell him," she said. When she ended the call, she sat in the silence for a long moment. Outside, Seattle glittered indifferently below her. Then she opened her laptop. But the post she wrote took 11 drafts and 45 minutes. She kept deleting sentences that sounded too corporate, too cold, too much like a job listing from a CEO who had forgotten that human beings were not employees. But she also kept deleting sentences that felt too vulnerable, too revealing, too much like an admission that something had gone catastrophically wrong with her personal life. She finally settled on something in the middle, seeking a man to play the role of my boyfriend for 3 days, Thursday to Sunday. Must be articulate, emotionally intelligent, and able to adapt to formal and casual settings. You will meet my parents at a lake house outside Seattle. Details provided upon vetting. Compensation, $20,000, half up front, half upon completion. No intimacy required or expected. This is a professional arrangement, serious inquiries only. She posted it on 2 platforms, one discreet, one less so, and then closed the laptop and went to bed and told herself she was not going to think about it until morning. She thought about it until 3 a.m. Ugh. By Wednesday afternoon, she had 214 responses. She read through them in her office between calls, scrolling past the ones that were immediately wrong. There were men who sent shirtless photos as their opening argument. Men who were clearly hoping $20,000 was just a starting negotiation. Men who wrote about what an honor it would be to spend time with someone of her caliber and her achievements, which told Victoria immediately that they had Googled her and were performing for the version of her they found online, not the actual person who would need to sit through dinner with her parents for 3 days without falling apart. She deleted those faster than the shirtless ones. Then there was the message that didn't look like the others. It came in late Wednesday afternoon, buried in a cluster of responses she'd almost given up on. It was short. It was not trying to impress her. That was the first thing she noticed. Ms. Hayes, I'm responding to your post. I'm a former high school teacher, currently working 2 jobs while raising my 7-year-old daughter alone. I'm not going to tell you I'm perfect for this, because I don't know enough about what you need to say that. What I can tell you is that I'm honest. I don't perform well under false pretenses for very long, and I'd rather tell you up front that I have conditions before we waste each other's time. I'm not interested in pretending to be in love with someone. I'm interested in showing up genuinely for 3 days as someone who cares about you, if that's something you actually need. If you want a performance, I'm the wrong person. If you want something real enough to fool the people who love you, that's a different conversation. Ethan Carter. Victoria read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She pulled up his name and found almost nothing. No social media presence worth noting. A LinkedIn page that hadn't been updated in 2 years, listing him as a history teacher at a public school in Tacoma. An old school newspaper article from 2019 with a photo, a man standing in front of a classroom whiteboard, laughing at something off camera, completely unaware he was being photographed. He looked like someone who was not trying to look like anything, which struck Victoria as unusual. Most people, when a camera appeared, became a slightly different version of themselves. He didn't look like someone who wanted to be impressive. She replied at 6:47 p.m. Can you meet Thursday morning? 8 a.m. I'll send an address. He replied 11 minutes later. I can rearrange my shift. See you then. No, of course, or absolutely, or it would be my pleasure. Just, yes, I can do that. See you then. Victoria stared at her screen for a moment, then did something she almost never did in professional contexts. She smiled. She almost canceled 3 times between Wednesday night and Thursday morning. The first time was at midnight, lying in the dark, running through the scenario with the cold clarity that always came when the city quieted down. She was Victoria Hayes. She ran a company with 1,400 employees and $2.3 billion in assets. She had rebuilt her entire life from a hospital bed after the accident, took the use of her legs, and nearly took her sense of self along with them. She had done all of it with discipline and intelligence and a carefully maintained refusal to need anyone. And now she was going to invite a stranger into her home and ask him to pretend to love her. The second time was Thursday at 6 a.m., after she'd been awake for 2 hours and had made the mistake of looking at herself in the bathroom mirror for too long. The woman in the reflection was tired in a specific way that sleep didn't fix. Her hair was down, which she rarely allowed. It felt less controlled, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup would handle later, but right now she could see every one of them. She thought about her mother walking through the door of the lake house, the way her face would open up when she saw Daniel, the way her father would shake his hand and measure him in that quiet way he had, nodding once if he decided the man was worth something. She couldn't disappoint them again. She couldn't watch her mother's face do the thing it did when it went careful and worried, that expression her parents tried to hide and never quite managed. Victoria had seen it in the hospital after the accident, and she'd spent 2 years doing everything in her power to make sure she never saw it again. She didn't cancel. The third almost cancellation came at 7:58 a.m. 2 minutes before Ethan Carter was due to arrive, when she was sitting in her wheelchair near the window and her phone showed the front desk camera. A man walking through the lobby in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, looking up at the lobby ceiling with what appeared to be genuine curiosity about the architecture. Not nervousness, not performance, just a man who had walked into a building and found it interesting. She almost called down and told the front desk to send him away. She didn't do that either. He was taller than she'd expected from the photo. That was the first thing she noticed when he walked into the penthouse. The way he moved through the space without filling it with performance. He looked around the living room once, taking it in without commenting on it, and then he looked at her directly. Most people, when they met Victoria for the first time, made one of 2 mistakes. They either looked at the wheelchair immediately and then overcorrected, forcing their gaze back to her face with visible effort, which was somehow worse than just looking. Or they went the other direction and performed an elaborate casualness, as if the wheelchair was so thoroughly unimportant that they needed to make absolutely sure she knew they'd noticed it wasn't important. Ethan Carter did neither. He just looked at her, the way you look at a person. Ms. Hayes, he said. He didn't offer his hand immediately, which told her he was paying attention, waiting to see how she moved, what the natural gesture was in her space. Mr. Carter, she gestured toward the couch. Sit down. Can I get you something? Coffee? I'm fine, thank you. He sat. She rolled slightly closer so they weren't shouting across the room, and he adjusted his position without making a production of it, just shifted so they were at a reasonable conversational angle. Small thing. She noticed it. Before we start, she said, I want to be clear about what this is. 3 days. My parents believe I've been dating someone named Daniel for 4 months. You would be Daniel. I can give you a full brief, things they know about you, conversations we've supposedly had, details that have come up. You'd need to learn them. That's a lot of material for 3 days, Ethan said. It's manageable. I kept the details consistent and relatively simple. Why Daniel? She blinked. I'm sorry? Why Daniel specifically, when you made up the name? Nobody had ever asked her that. She'd never thought about it. It was the first name that came to me, she said, which was true, but didn't feel like enough of an answer, and something about the way he was waiting told her he knew that. Okay, he said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I want to tell you what I wrote in the message again because I meant it. I'm not going to perform a relationship. I'll show up. I'll be present. I'll treat you with respect. But if your parents ask me something about you that I don't know the answer to, I'm going to find a way to handle that honestly instead of inventing more lies. That's my condition. Victoria felt the familiar tightening in her chest that happened when situations moved outside her control. That could create problems. I know it could. I'm telling you anyway, because the alternative is, I spend 3 days performing something hollow, your parents feel something is off, even if they can't name it, and you end up in a worse position than you started. He paused. How long has it been since you had a real conversation with them, not a managed one? The question landed strangely. She looked at him. That's not relevant to the arrangement, she said. Maybe not. He didn't push it. He sat back. What do you actually want out of these 3 days? Not the surface answer, not for them to believe Daniel is real. What do you actually want? The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a seagull crossed the window and disappeared. I want them to stop worrying about me, Victoria said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out before she could edit it into something more composed. I want them to see me and think, she's okay. She has someone. She's not alone in this apartment managing everything by herself and pretending that's the same thing as being fine. Ethan nodded, not with the performative sympathy she was bracing for, just recognition, like she'd said something true and he'd received it as such. I can do that, he said, but not as Daniel, as myself. He paused. I'll be honest with your parents if it comes to it, but I won't leave you hanging. That's the difference between what I'm offering and what you'll get from someone who's just running the script you wrote. She studied him for a long moment. She was good at reading people. It was one of the things that had made her dangerous in boardrooms for a decade. And what she read in Ethan Carter was something she didn't encounter often. A person who was not afraid of her, not recklessly unafraid, not performing bravery, just genuinely unbothered by her wealth, her status, the fact that she could end this conversation and choose someone more agreeable from the 213 other responses waiting in her inbox. She could. She knew she could. Your daughter, she said. How old? 7. Her name's Lily. Why do you need the money? He didn't flinch at the directness. Her mother left us a house when she died. I've been fighting to keep it for 3 years. I'm not going to lose it this month, but I'm close enough that $20,000 is the difference between her growing up in her mother's home or me having to move her somewhere else. He met Victoria's eyes. That's the honest version. The honest version. Your conditions are accepted, Victoria said, but I have one of my own. When we're in front of my parents, you follow my lead. If I redirect a conversation, you let me redirect it. If I need space, you read that and give it to me without making it a moment. Agreed. And don't treat me like I'm fragile. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. Not in private, not in front of them, not ever. I don't need it, and I don't want it. Ethan was quiet for a second. I don't think you're fragile, he said. I think you're someone who spent a long time making sure everyone around you knows exactly that. He paused. That's not the same thing as actually being fine. The silence between them was different this time. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile either. Half the payment transfers this afternoon, Victoria said. We leave for the lake house Friday morning. I'll have a car here at 7. I'll need to arrange care for Lily. Arrange it. Let me know if there are complications. He stood picking up his jacket from the arm of the couch. Then he stopped and looked back at her. For what it's worth. What you told me about your parents. That was real. Whatever we build on top of it over 3 days, that part was real. And people can feel the difference. He said it without drama, like it was just a fact. We can work with that. After he left, Victoria sat alone in the penthouse for a while. The lily stems still in their vase. The city still glittering below. She thought about what he'd said. People can feel the difference. She'd spent 4 months building Daniel as a fiction, and somehow a stranger had walked in, stayed 40 minutes, and told her the truest thing about her own situation that she'd heard in years. She wasn't sure yet whether that made him exactly what she needed. She wasn't sure it didn't either. Her parents landed in 6 hours. The lake house was 3 hours north. Victoria Hayes had built a billion-dollar company on the ability to make decisions under pressure, to commit fully to a course of action even when the ground was moving. She committed. And somewhere across the city, in a modest house in Tacoma, a former history teacher was calling his sister to ask if she could watch a 7-year-old for the weekend. Because something had shifted in his afternoon, and he wasn't entirely sure what he'd just agreed to, only that the woman in the wheelchair had looked at him like she was daring him to disappoint her. He had no intention of disappointing her. He didn't know yet what that decision would cost him. The drive to the lake house took 3 hours and 14 minutes, and for the first 40 of those minutes, neither of them said anything that mattered. Victoria sat in the back seat with her laptop open, scrolling through a contract her legal team had flagged overnight. Ethan sat beside her. She'd insisted the driver take the front, which left her and Ethan in the back together with a careful distance of about 18 inches between them. He had a worn paperback in his jacket pocket that he hadn't opened yet. He was looking out the window at the Washington State Highway sliding past, the Douglas firs crowding the road on both sides. The sky flat and gray the way Seattle skies got in spring when the rain hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to come down or just threaten. He hadn't asked about the laptop, hadn't made small talk, hadn't filled the silence with the particular kind of nervous chatter that told Victoria a person was uncomfortable and making it her problem. She closed the laptop after the second contract page. My parents land at 9, she said. They're renting a car. They'll be at the lake house by noon, maybe 12:30 depending on how long my mother takes at the baggage claim. Does she take long? She takes forever. She packs for a week like she's preparing for a climate she's never experienced before. Victoria paused. She grew up in Portland. She knows what Pacific Northwest weather looks like. Something shifted at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Not quite a smile. What's her name? Margaret. My father is Robert. He goes by Bob, but he hates when people he doesn't know call him Bob, so call him Robert until he tells you otherwise. Noted. Ethan shifted in his seat to face her slightly. What do they think I do for a living? She had prepared for this. I told my mother you work in education consulting. It's vague enough that it could mean anything and specific enough that it sounds real. So close enough to teaching that I won't trip over it. That was the intention. He nodded. He looked back out the window, then back at her. How long has it been since you've been to the lake house? The question caught her off guard, which annoyed her slightly because she'd spent the last day and a half preparing for questions she might not be ready for, and this one hadn't made the list. 2 summers ago, she said. Before the accident? 6 weeks before the accident. He didn't say I'm sorry. She was grateful for that. Instead, he just let the answer sit for a moment and then said, Is it going to be hard, being back there? I'm not sure, she said, which was the most honest answer she'd given anyone about the lake house in 2 years. She hadn't been prepared to say it, and she wasn't entirely sure why she had. There was something about the way Ethan asked questions, without the performance of concern, without the slight forward lean and softened voice that people used when they were managing her, that made honesty feel like less of a vulnerability. She opened the laptop again. He went back to the window. They didn't speak again for nearly an hour, and it was the most comfortable silence Victoria had experienced with another person in longer than she could immediately remember. The lake house was her father's achievement, not hers. Robert Hayes had built it with his own hands over 3 summers in the early 90s, before Victoria was born. With lumber he'd sourced himself and plans he'd drawn on graph paper at the kitchen table. He'd added the wraparound porch the summer Victoria turned 4. He'd built the dock the summer she turned 9, and she had stood on it while he worked, handing him tools he couldn't name yet, learning the names as she handed them over. She hadn't thought about that in years. Standing on that dock at 9 years old, holding a rubber mallet and not knowing what it was called, her father laughing when she'd described it as the banging thing. The house looked smaller than she remembered. That happened, she knew. Places shrank when you came back to them as an adult. But there was also the matter of the steps. 3 steps from the gravel driveway up to the front porch, and she sat in the back seat of the car, looking at those 3 steps while the driver unloaded the bags, and she felt the familiar calculus run through her head. The ramp she'd had installed on the side entrance last summer, which her father had done without being asked, and without mentioning to her, which she'd found out about from her mother 3 months after the fact. The side entrance added 40 feet to the path from the car. It was fine. It was always fine. She knew how to handle it. What she didn't know how to handle was Ethan standing near the back of the car, watching her do the calculus, and saying quietly, "Side entrance? How did you know about the side entrance?" "Your father mentioned it to my sister when she called to confirm the reservation details." He paused. "I called ahead." She stared at him. "You called ahead?" "I wanted to know the layout before we got here." He wasn't defensive about it. Not apologetic, either. "Is that overstepping?" She thought about it for a genuine second. A lot of people had done things for her over the last 2 years that they'd framed as consideration, and that had actually been about their own discomfort, their need to feel like they'd handled the situation, managed the problem, done the right thing. The test was usually whether it made her life easier or whether it made them feel better. This had made her life easier. "No," she said. "It's not overstepping." The side entrance had a gentle concrete ramp her father had poured himself, imperfect at the edges where he'd run short on material and made up the difference with a slightly different mix. She noticed that as she wheeled up it, the variation in texture, the small imperfection of it. Her father had done this in a weekend. He'd never mentioned it. He'd never asked for acknowledgement. She moved through the door into the mudroom and stopped. It smelled exactly the same. Cedar and wood smoke and something faintly like the lemon cleaner her mother used on the counters. 20 years of smell, layered into the walls, unchanged. She stayed there for just a moment. Ethan came through the door behind her, carrying 2 bags, and he stopped when he saw her stopped, and he didn't say anything. He set the bags down. He waited. "Kitchen's through there," she said finally, and moved forward. Her parents arrived at 12:47. She heard the car on the gravel before she saw them, and she straightened without realizing she'd been doing it. An automatic physical preparation she'd developed over 2 years. The impulse to appear composed before anyone walked through the door. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, her back to the wall, facing the entrance. Ethan was on the porch. She didn't know what he was doing out there. She hadn't asked. The front door opened. Her mother always came in the front door without knocking, which was a thing they had argued about in Victoria's 20s, and now she found oddly settling. And Margaret Hayes came through it first, talking before she was fully inside. "The highway was fine, but the exit. Robert, I told you the exit, didn't I? We almost missed it. Victoria, sweetheart." She crossed the room in 6 steps and came around the table and put both hands on Victoria's face, the way she had been doing since Victoria was small, framing her like a painting she needed to check was still hanging straight. "You look tired." "Hello, Mom." "I'm just saying, you look tired. You're working too much." She let go and straightened up. "Where's Daniel?" "He's on the porch." Margaret brightened immediately. She actually brightened. There was no other word for it. The way Victoria's mother lit up at the prospect of evidence that her daughter was okay. It was the thing Victoria had been trying to manufacture for 4 months, and seeing it in person, in the actual kitchen of the actual lake house, did something complicated to her chest. Her father came through the door behind her mother carrying both their bags, which he did every time without being asked, and which Margaret accepted every time without comment. Robert Hayes was 63, built like a man who had spent decades doing physical work and then stopped but kept the architecture of it, broad through the shoulders, unhurried in his movements. He set the bags down and looked at Victoria with the direct, quiet attention he'd always given her, which never contained pity and always contained something she couldn't name but had spent her whole life trying to deserve. "Hey, kid," he said. "Hey, Dad." He came around and put his hand on her shoulder once, brief, solid, and that was that. That was how Robert Hayes said, "I love you, and I've been worried about you, and I'm glad you're here." One hand on the shoulder for 3 seconds. The back door opened and Ethan came in, and Victoria watched her parents look at him. She had braced for this moment. She had run through versions of it on the drive up, scripting Ethan's introduction, planning what she would say and what he should say, and how she would manage the transition from "this is a professional arrangement" to "this is the man I've been dating for 4 months, who loves me and whom I love back." What she had not prepared for was Ethan coming in through the back door holding 2 pieces of firewood, because apparently while she'd been sitting at the kitchen table not drinking her tea, he had found the woodpile under the porch and started bringing it in. He set the wood by the fireplace, turned around, and extended his hand to her father first. Not her mother. Her father. "Robert," he said, I'm Ethan. It's good to meet you." Her father shook his hand and looked at him for a moment with that quiet, measuring look. "Good to meet you, too." A beat. "My daughter said education consulting." "Former high school teacher," Ethan said. "History. I consult now, but I miss the classroom more than I expected to." Her father's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just a degree or two of warmth. "What level?" "Juniors and seniors mostly. American history, some AP. I was a history teacher for 2 years out of college," her father said, "before I went into construction." Victoria had not known this. She had known her father had gone to college for 1 year before dropping out, and she had known he'd spent his 20s in construction, but she had not known about the teaching. She looked at her father. He was looking at Ethan. "What made you leave?" Ethan asked. "Couldn't afford it. 2-year-old at home." He meant Victoria. She knew that. She had never known that timeline before. "Couldn't take the pay." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know that math." Something passed between them. Recognition. The specific recognition of 2 men who had made the same calculation and arrived at different results but understood the weight of it. And Victoria sat at the kitchen table watching it happen, feeling entirely outside of it and somehow entirely included at the same time. Her mother touched her arm. "He's lovely," she said, in a whisper that was not quite a whisper. "Mom, I'm just saying." The first day was not easy, but it was not what Victoria had feared either. Lunch was pasta her mother made from a bag and a sauce from a jar, and a salad that nobody properly assembled, and it was the best meal Victoria had eaten in months, because the kitchen smelled like garlic, and her father was telling a story about the last time they'd been at the lake house that she'd almost forgotten. The summer of the raccoon, he was calling it, and her mother kept interrupting to correct details, and he kept talking right over the corrections with the comfortable disregard of a man who knew the interruptions were part of the story. Ethan ate across from her father and listened. He asked questions at the right moments. Not the questions of a man running a script. The questions of a man who was genuinely interested in the raccoon story and the summer her father had tried to reinforce the deck and the argument that had ensued about whether you could mix pressure-treated and untreated lumber. "You can't," Ethan said when her father finished. "That's what I said," her father said. "I said it every day for 3 weeks." "Robert, you did not say it every day," her mother said. "Every single day." Victoria ate her pasta and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like the absence of the particular tension she carried at every family event. The performance of okayness, the management of her parents' worry, the careful curation of her own image as a woman who was handling it. She was still here, still in the wheelchair. The lake house was still full of places and angles that were harder than they used to be. None of that had changed. But for 45 minutes over bad pasta and a good raccoon story, she was just a person at a table with people who loved her, and it didn't feel like a production. She glanced at Ethan. He was laughing at something her father had said. His laugh was real. She could tell the difference now, after just a day and a half, between his polite attention and his actual engagement. When he was actually engaged, something shifted in his face, the careful neutrality dropping away into something younger and less guarded. He caught her looking at him. His expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged her. She looked away first. After lunch, her father disappeared to check on the dock, an annual inspection ritual that hadn't changed in 30 years, and her mother went to unpack. Ethan was in the kitchen washing dishes, which Victoria had not asked him to do. She wheeled to the kitchen doorway. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He kept washing. "I have a dishwasher." "I know, I saw it." He rinsed a bowl and set it in the rack. "Your father likes you." "My father is my father." "That's not what I mean. I mean, he looks at you like you're the thing he's most proud of. Not the company. You." He glanced over his shoulder. "Not a lot of people have that." She didn't know what to say to that. She stayed in the doorway. "Your mother watches you when you're not looking," he continued. "Not with pity, with, I don't know, like she's checking that you're still breathing and she can't stop herself." He turned off the water. "They're not here to see the CEO. They don't care about the company. They just want to see their daughter." "I know that," Victoria said. Her voice came out more brittle than she'd intended. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you've been managing them all morning like a difficult client you're trying not to lose." He turned around, drying his hands on the dish towel that hung from the oven handle. "What would happen if you just let them see you?" "I let them see me." "You let them see the version of you that has everything under control." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, through the window over the sink, she could see the dock and her father's figure out on it, crouching down to check a plank. "The version that has everything under control is the only version that doesn't worry them," she said. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or maybe they'd worry less if you let them in far enough to actually help." He folded the dish towel. "I'm not trying to tell you how to manage your own family. I watched my daughter for 8 months after her mother died, trying not to cry in front of me because she thought it would make me sad. 8 months before I finally sat her down and told her she didn't have to protect me from her grief." He paused. "She was 7. You're 33. Victoria stared at him. "That's a fairly aggressive thing to say to someone you've known for 48 hours, she said. "Yeah," he agreed. He wasn't apologetic about it. "You told me not to treat you like you were fragile. I'm taking that seriously." She sat with that for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, cutting across the kitchen floor in a long strip, and the house smelled like cedar and the garlic her mother had been heavy-handed with. And Ethan Carter was standing by her oven, looking at her like he was waiting for her to decide something. "The accident," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. She said it anyway. "It wasn't just the injury. I was in the car alone. I'd been working 16-hour days for 6 weeks straight, and I drove myself home from the office at midnight because I didn't want to wait for the car service. I drove into a median at 60 miles an hour because I fell asleep behind the wheel." She met his eyes. "I did it to myself, and I have never told my parents that." The silence was very still. "They think a truck hit me," she continued. "There was a truck near the scene. It was easy to let the story settle into something that wasn't my fault." She exhaled slowly. "I have been very carefully protecting that story for 2 years." Ethan didn't react the way she'd expected. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look sorry. He looked like a man absorbing information and deciding what it actually meant. "You were exhausted," he said. "Not reckless. Exhausted. Same result." "Not the same thing." He leaned against the counter. "Why are you telling me this?" She didn't have a clean answer for that. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't told anyone." "Not your therapist?" "I had a therapist for 3 months after the accident. She was very good. I stopped going when she started asking questions I didn't want to answer. Questions like this one. Questions like this one." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You don't have to tell your parents. That's your decision. But I think the thing you're protecting them from isn't the story of the accident. I think it's the idea that you're a person who pushed herself until she broke." He said it evenly, without drama. "And I think they might already know that, and they love you anyway, and you're the only one still holding it against yourself." Victoria looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light shifted across the floor. You were a history teacher, she said finally. Yeah. Seems like a waste. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. I'll tell my students you said that. Chuts. The afternoon moved the way lake house afternoons always had, slowly and without agenda. Her father repaired a hinge on the back gate that had been loose for 3 years, working with the steady patience of a man who understood that things broke and you fixed them, and that was the whole of it. Her mother read on the porch with a blanket over her lap, calling out observations about the lake and the clouds with no expectation of response. Ethan spent an hour helping her father with the gate, and Victoria watched them from the porch without intending to watch them. They worked with the easy compatibility of men who didn't need to fill silence. Her father leading, Ethan following without needing it, explained that he was following, the two of them moving around each other in the small space by the back fence with the natural adjustment of people who respected each other's area. Her mother came and sat beside her. He's good with his hands, Margaret observed. He taught history, Mom. Men who teach high school know how to do things. It's self-defense. Her mother turned her teacup in her hands. He looks at you. People generally look at the person they're talking to. Victoria. Her mother's voice was mild but certain, the voice she used when she was not going to be redirected. He looks at you when you're not talking, when you're just sitting there. He looks at you like he's making sure you're still in the room. She paused. Your father used to look at me like that. He still does sometimes when he thinks I'm not paying attention. Victoria watched Ethan hand her father a screwdriver without being asked for one. He'd just seen what was needed and reached for it. Her father took it without looking up. He's a good man, her mother said. Not a question. Yes, Victoria said. And the strange thing, the thing that stayed with her for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, was that it wasn't a lie. Dinner was her father's chicken, which he made exactly the same way he had made it since Victoria was 12. Too much garlic, not enough salt, overcooked in a way that should have been bad but had become the specific flavor of every important family meal she could remember. Her mother corrected the salt silently by adding it to her own plate and then reaching across to add it to Robert's, which he accepted without comment. Ethan ate 2 servings and said sincerely that the chicken was good, and her father looked at him with the expression of a man receiving a compliment he considered accurate. After dinner, her father built a fire. The lake house had a stone fireplace that Robert had laid himself in 1997, slightly uneven along the left side where he'd run out of the right mortar and substituted. And the 4 of them sat in the living room while the rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived, running down the windows in long, irregular lines. Her parents talked. They told the stories they always told, the ones Victoria had heard so many times she could anticipate the punchlines. But Ethan hadn't heard them, and watching him hear them for the first time gave them a strange new dimension. She found herself listening differently, hearing the stories through the gap between his face and her own memory. At some point, her father asked Ethan about his daughter. Ethan talked about Lily the way people talk about the thing they love most and are slightly afraid to look at directly, with a sideways approach, picking moments rather than sweeping descriptions. Lily had decided recently that she was going to be a marine biologist. She had a library book about octopuses that she'd renewed 4 times because she kept rereading it. She made breakfast for herself on Saturday mornings now, which was theoretically independence building and practically terrifying because she had opinions about the stove. How does she feel about you being gone this weekend? Margaret asked. She told me to bring her back a rock from the lake, Ethan said. Specific instructions. Had to be smooth on one side and interesting on the other. Her mother laughed, a real laugh. Victoria watched her parents look at Ethan and then look at her, and she saw it. The thing she'd been trying to manufacture for 4 months, the thing no amount of detail about a fictional Daniel could have produced. They weren't looking at her like she was okay. They were looking at her like she was good, like she had somehow managed, despite everything, to find her way to this room, this fire, this particular person sitting 3 feet away from her who was describing his 7-year-old daughter's rock collection criteria with complete seriousness. She looked at the fire instead of at Ethan. She looked at the fire and felt, in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain, like she was not performing anything at all. The rain came down. The fire held. Outside, the lake received the rain without complaint, as it had for every season before this one, and would for every season after, indifferent and constant and entirely itself. Victoria Hayes sat in her father's lake house, and for the first time in 2 years, she did not feel like she was managing anything. She felt, with a precision that almost frightened her, like she was simply there. Sunday morning came in quiet, the way lake house mornings always did. The lake flat and gray-green in the early light, the trees still holding the night's rain on their needles, the kitchen smelling like the coffee her father had started before anyone else was awake. Victoria heard him moving around down there at 6:15, the familiar sounds of a man who had never learned to sleep past dawn, and she lay in the dark of the upstairs room listening to the house breathe around her and thought about the fact that in approximately 4 hours the arrangement would be over. Ethan's transfer was scheduled for Monday morning. The second half of the payment, clean and automatic, the way she handled everything that she wanted to keep from becoming complicated. She stared at the ceiling and told herself that was exactly right. That was exactly how it should go. She got up at 6:40 and found her father alone in the kitchen, which was what she'd been half hoping for and half dreading. Robert Hayes was sitting at the table with his coffee and the newspaper he'd driven 20 minutes to get from the gas station on the county road, the way he did every single morning of every visit without ever explaining why he needed a physical newspaper when the same information was available on the phone in his pocket. It was a habit. He had a lot of habits. Victoria had spent her 20s being mildly impatient with them, and her 30s understanding that they were the architecture of a man who knew exactly who he was. "Morning," she said. "Morning, kid." He reached over and poured a cup from the carafe without being asked. He set it on the table at the spot next to him, the accessible side, the side where there was no chair in the way. He'd been doing that since her first visit after the accident, removing the chair, leaving space. Never mentioned it. She wheeled to the table and picked up the cup. They sat in the comfortable quiet that was the best thing about her father. The man could simply be in a room with you without needing the room to be full of him. Outside, a loon called from somewhere on the lake, one long rising note that died into the gray morning. "He's a good man," her father said. He was looking at the newspaper. Victoria wrapped both hands around the cup. "You said that last night." "I'm saying it again." He turned a page. "Different reasons." She waited. "Last night I said it because of how he talked about his daughter. A man who talks about his kid the way he does, without performing it, without making it into something impressive. That's a man who's actually present for it." Her father set the newspaper down. He looked at her directly, which he did rarely enough that she always felt it when he did. "This morning I'm saying it because of how he talked about you." Something shifted in her chest. "When did you two talk about me?" "Last night, after you went up. He stayed for a while by the fire." Her father picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything dramatic. He said you were one of the most self-sufficient people he'd ever met, and that sometimes that was a hard thing to be. He paused. He said he thought you'd gotten used to carrying things alone because it was faster than teaching someone else to carry them with you. The kitchen was very quiet. "He said that," Victoria said. "He said that." Her father took a sip of coffee. Then he said goodnight and went to bed. He looked back at the newspaper. "I liked him before that. I liked him more after." Victoria looked at her coffee. She thought about Ethan sitting by the dying fire after she'd gone upstairs, talking to her father with the same directness he used on everyone, and she felt something she couldn't entirely categorize. Not quite gratitude, not quite the particular unsettling sensation of being known more accurately than you'd consented to. "Dad," she said. The accident." She hadn't planned to say it. She'd lain awake the previous night running through what Ethan had said in the kitchen on Friday. They'd worry less if you let them in far enough to actually help. And she'd told herself she wasn't going to do anything with it. She was going to let the weekend end and go back to Seattle and pay Ethan his money and return to the life she'd rebuilt carefully and alone. She'd told herself that very clearly. "I know," her father said. She looked up. Robert Hayes was looking at his newspaper but not reading it. "I know you were driving yourself. I've known for about a year." He turned the page slowly, with the careful unhaste of a man who'd prepared for this conversation. "A man I know works at the hospital you went to. Not your doctor, just someone in administration. He mentioned something that didn't match what we'd been told." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say anything because I figured you had reasons for the story you told. And because it didn't change a single thing for me. Victoria couldn't speak. She sat across from her father in the early morning kitchen and could not find a single word. "You were running yourself into the ground," he said. "That's not the same as being careless. That's being a person who doesn't know how to stop." He finally looked at her. His eyes were the same dark brown as hers, direct and without performance. "I've never been disappointed in you, Victoria. Not once. I want you to know that, since I think you've been carrying around a guess that I might be." She looked down at her coffee. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to permit in her father's kitchen at 6:40 in the morning, and she pressed her lips together and breathed. "Okay," she said, when she could say something. "Okay," he said. He picked up the newspaper again. "Your mother made cinnamon rolls last night while you were asleep. They're in the oven on warm. She's been waiting for someone to notice." Victoria breathed out slowly. "She always makes cinnamon rolls when she's trying to make something feel normal." 35 years I've been benefiting from that strategy," her father said, not complaining. She almost laughed. It came out as something adjacent to a laugh, rough at the edges, but her father smiled at his newspaper and she picked up her coffee and the loon called again from the lake. And that was enough. It was enough. Busamos. Ethan found her on the dock at 8:30. She'd gone down alone, navigating the ramp and the path her father had cleared at some point in the last year, gravel replaced with packed dirt, and 2 boards laid flat over the rough patch near the water's edge. And she'd been sitting at the end of the dock for 40 minutes, watching the mist come off the lake in thin, irregular columns, thinking about nothing with unusual success. She heard him on the boards behind her and knew it was him from the weight of the step. He came to the end of the dock and stood beside her, looking out at the water, and didn't say anything for a while. "My father told me what you said to him last night," she said. "I figured he might." "You did that on purpose." "I said what was true," Ethan said. "I didn't engineer the conversation." He paused. "Did it land wrong?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "It landed exactly right. That's almost more disorienting." He sat down on the dock beside her, legs hanging over the edge, which put his eye level roughly at hers. She'd noticed he did that, adjusted his physical position in ways that were subtle enough that you didn't register them as adjustments, just as a natural way of being in a space. "We go back today," she said. "I know." "The arrangement ends Monday morning when the transfer clears." "I know that too." She looked at the water. A fish broke the surface near the far bank and was gone. "My company's quarterly board meeting is in 3 weeks. We have a shareholder presentation the week after." She said it to the lake, not to him. "My schedule from here to the end of the month is Victoria." She stopped. "You don't have to explain your schedule to me," he said. "I know what we agreed to." "I'm not explaining my schedule. She stopped again. She genuinely wasn't sure what she was doing. She had a talent for turning emotional situations into logistical problems, and she could feel herself doing it right now. And the irritating part was that the impulse was so automatic she'd been halfway into the schedule recitation before she'd noticed. "You're trying to make sure we both know this ends today," Ethan said, not unkindly. "Yes, we both know that." Good. The lake moved in small, unhurried patterns. Somewhere behind them, the house was waking up. She could hear her mother's voice carrying from the kitchen window, talking to no one in particular in that way she had, narrating her own morning. "Lily's going to ask me about the rock," Ethan said. "Did you find one?" "I found 3. She's getting to pick." Something warm moved through Victoria's chest at that. She didn't examine it. "Tell her the lake is colder than it looks," she said, "and that there's a blue heron that comes to the south bank in the morning. I used to watch it from this dock when I was a kid." Ethan looked at her. "You could tell her yourself." The suggestion sat between them. Victoria didn't respond to it, and he didn't push it, and after a moment he looked back at the water. They sat on the dock until her mother called them in for breakfast, and Victoria would remember it later. Not the conversation exactly, but the quality of it. The way it was possible to sit next to a person in actual silence, not the managed silence of 2 people avoiding something, but the simple silence of 2 people who had run out of things they needed to perform for each other and found that what was left was enough. The drive back to Seattle was different from the drive up. Her parents left first, heading to a hotel downtown before their Monday morning flight, her mother holding Victoria's face again at the door and telling her she looked less tired than she had on Friday, which was Margaret Hayes's version of I love you. And this weekend was good, and I'm going to worry about you less now. Just a little. Her father shook Ethan's hand, and the handshake lasted slightly longer than handshakes usually did. And neither man said anything except her father saying, "Take care of yourself," and Ethan saying, "You too, sir." And that was that. In the car going back, Victoria's phone stayed in her bag for the first hour, which was unusual. She watched the highway instead and thought about her father's face when he'd told her he'd known about the accident. The way his expression hadn't changed. The years she'd spent protecting a story he'd already seen through. Her phone buzzed at the 90-minute mark. Then again. Then 3 times in quick succession, and she felt the specific vibration pattern of her chief of staff's alert setting, which Priya only used when something had crossed from important into urgent. She pulled out the phone. 7 missed messages. 2 from Priya, 1 from her general counsel, Marcus Webb, 2 from board members, one of them being James Okafor, who was the most unflappable person Victoria had ever employed, which meant that if James was calling on a Sunday, the situation had escalated past the point where unflappable people could manage it with email. She opened Priya's message first. Harrington filed the preliminary paperwork this morning. He's going for the board seats. Marcus says we have 72 hours before it becomes public. Call me when you can. Victoria read it twice. The name landed like a hand on a cold surface. Sudden, clarifying. David Harrington. She knew the name the way you knew the name of a weather event that had been tracked for days before it arrived. He'd been circling Hayes Technologies for 8 months, taking small positions, making quiet inquiries through intermediaries, feeling for weakness with the patient deliberateness of someone who wasn't in a hurry because he believed the outcome was inevitable. He was 61 years old, ran a private equity firm out of New York, had a reputation for acquiring companies that were, as he'd described it in a profile 2 years ago, temporarily distracted by their own stories. He had been waiting for her to be distracted. He had picked this weekend. "Something's wrong," Ethan said. She looked up. He was watching her in the peripheral way he had. Not staring, just aware. "Business," she said. "Bad?" She looked at the phone again. James Okafor's message was 1 sentence. "We need to talk before tomorrow morning. This isn't just a business move." "Possibly," she said. She was already dialing Priya. By the time the car reached Seattle, she had the shape of it. Harrington had filed for a special shareholder meeting, citing what his team was calling governance concerns, a phrase that in corporate language meant nothing specific and everything damaging. He had quietly accumulated 12.4% of Hayes Technologies' outstanding shares over 8 months through a series of shell entities that had been careful enough to stay below the disclosure thresholds until now. The preliminary paperwork named 3 board seats he intended to contest. If he took 3 seats, he had leverage. If he leveraged correctly and got 2 more current board members to flip, and Priya thought she knew which 2, he had operational control without a majority position. It was elegant in the way that a trap was elegant. It had been built slowly, and it had been built while Victoria was recovering, and then rebuilding, and then managing, and it had been built by someone who understood that the best time to move against a person was when they were exhausted from surviving something else. "He's been planning this for at least a year," Marcus told her on the call. "Maybe longer. Some of the shell positions go back 18 months. "Before the accident," Victoria said. A pause on the line. "Yes." She sat in the back of the car with the city coming back into view, the skyline resolving out of the gray afternoon, familiar and indifferent, and she felt the things she always felt when a threat became fully visible, not panic, a cold, clarifying focus, like a lens tightening. "Get everyone on a call tonight," she said. 9 o'clock. I want legal, I want Priya, I want James, and I want whoever we have on shareholder relations." She paused. "Don't tell them about the timeline yet. I want to understand what we have before we start communicating defensively." "Understood." She ended the call. Ethan was looking out his window. She wasn't sure how much of the conversation he'd been able to hear, but she suspected most of it. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the last half of the drive." Don't be. He kept looking out the window. Is your company okay? It will be. That's not what I asked. She looked at the side of his face. The city moved past the window behind him. Someone is making a move on the board. He's been building the position for a year and a half. He filed today because... She stopped. Because he thought you'd be distracted, Ethan said. Yes. He turned from the window. His expression was doing something she hadn't seen from him before, not the careful neutrality he used when he was listening, not the directness he used when he was saying something she didn't want to hear. This was something more personal than either of those, something closer to anger. He timed it for a weekend, Ethan said. He timed it for this weekend specifically, I think. My parents were visiting. He probably assumed I'd be managing that instead of watching the filings. She heard herself say it and felt a secondary wave of cold clarity. Someone told him. Told him your parents were visiting? Or told him I was out of the office? Or told him the filing window was clear? She pressed her mouth together. I have a leak. I've suspected it for 3 months. This confirms it. The car pulled up to her building. The driver came around to the rear passenger door. Ethan got out first and then moved aside. Not to help her, just to give her space to move through the door, which was exactly the right instinct and which she'd stopped expecting from people. She transferred to her chair in the practiced way that was now so automatic it cost her nothing. And she looked up and Ethan was already at the back of the car getting their bags, talking to the driver about something that had nothing to do with her. She watched him for a second, a man doing the next practical thing, not waiting to be thanked for the space he'd given her, not performing sensitivity about it. She thought about Harrington filing his paperwork this morning while she was sitting on a dock watching mist come off a lake, and she felt the cold focus sharpen into something harder. Ethan, she said. He turned, a bag over each shoulder. Thank you, she said, for the weekend, for my parents, for... She stopped and recalibrated because she'd been about to say something true and sweeping, and she wasn't ready for that. For the dock, this morning. That was... I needed that. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. Me too. Neither of them moved. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus. She looked at the screen and back at Ethan. I have to, go, he said. I know. She went. The 9 o'clock call lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. By midnight, she had the structure of Harrington's position mapped on a whiteboard in her home office, her legal team's analysis open on one monitor, and the shareholder registry on the other, a cup of cold coffee on the desk that she kept forgetting to drink. Marcus walked her through the filing point by point, and with each point the picture became clearer and more deliberate and more personal. He's not coming for the company, she said sometime around 11, interrupting Marcus mid-sentence. A pause. The board seats would give him, he doesn't want to run Hayes Technologies. He doesn't have the operational team for it, and he knows it. He wants to install a management team that he controls and take the company public within 3 years. He'll make money on the IPO and be gone. She looked at the whiteboard. But that's the strategy. That's not the reason. Let's put some tomato. She tapped a name on the registry. Pull everything you can find on Harrington's history with a company called Meridian Data. Mid-2010s. I think there's a connection to someone I fired in 2017. She heard Marcus writing. I'll have it by morning. Tonight, she said. I need it tonight. After the call, she sat alone in the office for a while. The city was quiet at this hour. Not silent. Cities were never silent, but quieted. The daytime noise sunk to a lower frequency. She could see the Space Needle from her office window, lit against the dark sky. She picked up her phone and put it down 3 times before she typed the message. I know you're probably asleep. The weekend helped. More than I expected. I wanted to say that while I still knew how to say it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she deleted it and put the phone down and went back to the whiteboard. 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Not asleep. Lily wanted the lake rocks identified before she'd accept them. I've been on the internet for an hour learning the difference between andesite and basalt. Are you okay? She read it twice. Something in her chest moved in a way she didn't have language for. Working, she typed back. But yes, I think so. His response came fast. Good. The rocks, by the way, are all 3-bay salt. She's very pleased. She says the lake has excellent taste in geology. Victoria Hayes, sitting alone in her office at midnight, surrounded by the architecture of a corporate attack that had been months in the making, with a board meeting 3 weeks away, and a leak somewhere in her organization, and a fight ahead of her that was going to require everything she had, Victoria Hayes read that message about the basalt and the 7-year-old's geological approval, and something shifted in her face that she wouldn't have recognized as a smile if she'd been watching herself in a mirror. She set the phone down. She went back to the whiteboard. Marcus had the Meridian file to her by 2 in the morning. She read it in one sitting, and the further she read, the more the picture stopped being a business story and became a different kind of story entirely. Meridian Data had been a mid-sized tech company in 2015, and David Harrington had held a significant position in it. And in 2016, Hayes Technologies had acquired one of Meridian's key clients in a deal that had accelerated Meridian's decline. That part was known. That part was business. What wasn't known? What Marcus had found in a thread of SEC filings and 2 investor lawsuit settlements and 1 paragraph in a deposition from 2018 was that the man who'd led the client negotiations on the Hayes side, the man who had structured the deal that effectively pulled the floor out from under Meridian, was a senior VP named Gerald Finch. Gerald Finch, who Victoria had terminated in 2017 for cause. Gerald Finch, who had spent 3 years after his termination consulting for various private equity firms. Gerald Finch, who was currently listed on the organizational chart of Harrington Capital as a senior advisor. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. There it was. Harrington wasn't just a corporate raider who'd identified a vulnerable target. He was the vehicle. Gerald Finch was the architect. A man she'd fired for falsifying compliance reports had spent 3 years building a relationship with a man who had a grievance against Hayes Technologies. And together they had constructed a takeover attempt built on a foundation of personal revenge, dressed up as shareholder activism. She had enemies. She'd always had enemies. You didn't build a company of this size in this industry without accumulating them. But she'd assumed her enemies would come at her with the tools of business, better technology, better talent, better positioning. She hadn't accounted for a grudge patient enough to wait 3 years. She called Marcus at 2:17 a.m. "The Finch connection," she said when he picked up. "I need to know everything." "I thought you might." He didn't sound like a man who'd been woken up. She suspected he hadn't been. "I'm already pulling it." How clean is the line between Finch and Harrington's filing strategy? Clean enough that it's there. Messy enough that it'll take work to prove. A pause. "Victoria, this is manageable. This is actually more manageable than a clean business play would be, because if Finch has been advising this strategy, it's built on a narrative that we can unravel. But it's going to take time and it's going to take you staying. Steady," she said. "That's the word." She looked at the whiteboard, the map of Harrington's position, the board seats, the timeline, and underneath all of it, somewhere in the foundation where the structure was supposed to be clean, a 3-year-old wound being used as architecture. "Get some sleep," she said. "I need you sharp tomorrow." "You too." She ended the call and sat alone in the office. The whiteboard, the cold coffee, the Space Needle in the window, unchanging and lit against the dark. She thought about what Ethan had said on the dock that morning. Not the words exactly, but the quality of them. The way he'd said things that were true without making them into weapons. The way he looked at her like the wheelchair and the company and the image and the accident were all just context. And what he was actually looking at was something underneath all of it that he seemed to find worth looking at. She thought about her father's hand on her shoulder for 3 seconds at the lake house. 3 seconds that said everything. She thought about Harrington, somewhere in New York, looking at his phone this morning and seeing the weekend filing land and thinking he'd timed it perfectly. Thinking she was distracted. Thinking she was soft. She rolled to the desk, opened a new document. She began to write. Not a legal strategy, not a board memo. She wrote a list, specific, unsentimental, built from 20 minutes of pure clarity, of every actual point of leverage she had. The relationships she'd built, the shareholders she knew personally, the narrative she could tell about Hayes Technologies that was true, that was earned, that no private equity firm with a revenge motive and a shell company structure could replicate or refute. She wrote it the way her father built things. Not perfectly, not quickly. With the steady attention of someone who understood that the work itself was the point, and the point was to make something that would hold. By 3:30, she had the beginning of something that felt like a plan. By 4, she was in bed, and she did not stare at the ceiling. She slept. The leak had a name by Tuesday morning. It wasn't someone Victoria had suspected, which was the part that sat with her longest, not the betrayal itself, which she'd learned years ago to treat as a business variable rather than a personal wound, but the specific miscalculation of her own instincts. She'd spent 2 years watching her team, reading rooms, calibrating trust with the precision she applied to everything, and she'd missed it. His name was Connor Reeves, 31 years old, junior analyst in shareholder relations, 18 months with the company. Not a senior employee, not someone with access to strategy, but someone who attended the weekly operations brief, which meant he heard enough fragments to be useful to the right person, and someone who had, it turned out, a considerable gambling debt and a connection to Gerald Finch that predated his hiring at Hayes Technologies by 14 months. Priya had found it. She'd gone through expense reports and access logs and cross-referenced the visitor registry for the last year, and at 10:40 Tuesday morning, she'd walked into Victoria's office and set a single printed page on the desk and said, "It's Connor Reeves," in the flat, careful voice she used when she was angry and controlling it. Victoria had looked at the page for a long time without speaking. "How certain are you?" she said. "Certain enough that Marcus already knows and is deciding what it means legally." Priya sat down. He accessed the travel calendar the Thursday before Harrington filed. "Your parents' visit was on it. The lake house address was on it." She paused. He also accessed the shareholder registry 3 times in the last 6 weeks, dates that tracked directly to Harrington's acquisition schedule. Victoria set the page down. She looked out the window. The Seattle sky was doing its late April thing, bright for 20 minutes, then a bank of cloud, then bright again, as if it couldn't commit. "Don't terminate him yet," she said. Priya blinked. "Victoria, if Finch and Harrington know we found the leak, they'll know we've mapped the connection. I want 3 more days." She turned from the window. "Get Marcus to document everything we have and lock it. Connor doesn't know we know. We use that." "Use it how?" "I haven't decided yet." She looked at the page again. "But a leak that works in both directions is a tool, not just a liability." Priya stared at her for a moment with the expression she reserved for when Victoria said something that was either very smart or going to create significant additional problems. "I'll tell Marcus to hold." "Thank you." After Priya left, Victoria sat alone for a while. The office was quiet. Below the window, Seattle was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, enormous. And she thought about Connor Reeves, 31 years old with a gambling debt, who had made a calculation about which direction the power would fall and had calculated wrong. She didn't feel angry about it. She wanted to examine that, the absence of anger, and understand it, because 2 years ago she would have felt the anger first and let it run everything that came after. Instead, what she felt was something closer to tired. Not defeated, just tired of the specific human tendency to mistake someone's vulnerability for an invitation. She picked up her phone. She looked at Ethan's last message from Sunday night, the one about basalt and Lily's approval of the lake's geological taste, and she typed, "I identified the leak. It's a junior analyst. I'm not as angry as I expected to be. Is that a problem?" She stared at it, then sent it before she could second-guess the impulse. His response came back in 4 minutes, which meant he was on a break from whatever shift he was working. "Why would not being angry be a problem?" "In my experience," she typed, "anger is useful. It's clean fuel. I'm not sure what to run on when it's not there." A longer pause this time. Then, "Maybe you're just tired of fighting the way you used to fight. That's not the same as losing the will to fight." She read that twice. She set the phone face down on the desk and went back to work. And she carried that sentence with her for the rest of the day the way you carry something small and heavier than it looks. The board meeting was in 16 days, and the 2 weeks leading up to it were the kind of 2 weeks that compressed time. Days that were 14 hours long and felt like 3. Nights that were 4 hours of sleep and felt like falling. Victoria worked. That was what she knew how to do, and she did it with the particular focus that came when the target was clear and the stakes were real. Marcus built the legal case against Finch's involvement, tracing the advisory relationship through 3 separate consulting agreements and a paper trail that was, as he put it, not quite a smoking gun, but a gun with gunshot residue on it, which in front of the right audience is close enough. Priya managed the shareholder outreach, working the phones with the quiet persistence of someone who understood that in corporate battles, the difference between winning and losing was usually just the number of calls you were willing to make. Victoria made calls too. She called shareholders she'd met once at events 3 years ago. She called board members she'd inherited from the company's founding and had spent years maintaining relationships with through the kind of careful, unflashy attention that didn't make headlines. She called 2 institutional investors that Harrington's team had apparently assumed were soft targets, and she discovered in both conversations that the assumptions had been wrong. "He doesn't know your actual shareholders," James Okafor told her on a Thursday afternoon call, and she could hear the particular satisfaction in his voice of a man who had been worried and was beginning to be less so. "His information is 6 months old, maybe more. He knows the position percentages, but he doesn't know the people." "Finch's information," Victoria said. "Gerald Finch's last contact with these shareholders was when he was still here. That was 2017. 7 years, James said. "These relationships have changed. You've changed." A pause. "The accident. Oh, I don't mean it the way it sounds. I mean how you've handled the last 2 years has mattered to people. More than you probably know." She sat with that after the call. The accident. How she'd handled it. She thought she'd handled it by becoming impenetrable, by returning to work faster than anyone expected and performing competence at a volume that left no room for doubt. She thought she'd handled it like a problem to be solved. Maybe that wasn't the whole of what people had seen. Ethan texted on a Wednesday evening. Not about anything specific. He sent a photo of a history test question that one of his students had answered with such spectacular creative wrongness that he'd photographed it for later. And the question was about the causes of the First World War, and the student had attributed the assassination of Franz Ferdinand to general bad vibes in Europe, which was, Victoria thought, not entirely incorrect as a characterization. She laughed. Actually laughed, alone in her apartment at 9:15 on a Wednesday with her laptop open and 3 unread briefs on the desk. "That student isn't wrong," she typed back. "That student got partial credit," Ethan replied. "Don't tell anyone." She smiled at her phone. Then she went back to the briefs, and the smile stayed longer than she expected. They had been texting like this for almost 2 weeks. Not every day, not with any declared frequency, just intermittently, in the spaces between the things that actually required their attention. He'd send something about Lily or a student or a piece of news he'd found interesting. She'd send back something dry or specific, and he'd respond with the same lack of performance he'd brought to everything since the beginning. No pressure in the exchanges, no subtext she needed to manage. She caught herself looking forward to the phone buzzing. She noticed that she noticed, and she set it aside and got back to work. 8 days before this board meeting, she made a decision that surprised her own legal team. They were 3 hours into a strategy session when Marcus walked her through the final version of the case against Harrington's filing. The Finch connection, the retaliatory motive, the aged shareholder data, the 3 board candidates Harrington had put forward who, on examination, had no meaningful technology sector governance experience and existed primarily as Finch-adjacent names. It was a strong case. It was, Marcus said carefully, almost certainly strong enough to force a withdrawal if they went public with the Finch connection before the shareholder meeting. "We file a counter-disclosure, we release the Finch advisory relationship, we let the financial press do the rest," Marcus said. Harrington's narrative falls apart in 72 hours. His own limited partners start asking questions. He withdraws. Victoria looked at the document spread across the conference table. "And Finch," she said, "career ending, most likely. The SEC referral alone." "I don't want to do it that way," she said. The room was quiet. 5 people around the table, all of them looking at her. "Victoria," Marcus said carefully, "this is the cleanest path." "It's the most destructive path," she said. "There's a difference." She pulled one of the documents toward her. "If we go public with this before the meeting, it becomes a public fight. Financial press, speculation, 6 months of Hayes Technologies and governance battle leading every story about the company. My employees spend 6 months in uncertainty. My shareholders spend 6 months nervous. She set the document back down. And for what? To punish David Harrington publicly? To stop him, Priya said. Not argumentatively, genuinely. I can stop him without burning it all down. Victoria looked around the table. I want a private disclosure, delivered directly to Harrington's legal team, with a clear account of what we have, what we're prepared to file with the SEC if the takeover attempt doesn't withdraw, and a proposed timeline for his exit from the shareholder position. She paused. Quiet. Clean. He withdraws citing strategic realignment. We never say the word Finch publicly. The silence in the room had texture to it. That lets him walk away, Marcus said. Yes. After what he tried to do, after what Finch tried to use him to do, Victoria corrected, Harrington is a vehicle for a grudge. I'm not interested in destroying the vehicle. I'm interested in the road being clear. She leaned back in her chair. And I want a separate conversation with Finch, not legal, not on the record. I want to sit in a room with Gerald Finch, and I want to understand how a man I employed for 4 years decided that this was worth 3 years of his life. Marcus stared at her. That is, Victoria, that's unusual, she agreed. Do it anyway. After the meeting, Priya walked with her to the elevator. They rode down 2 floors without talking, and then Priya said, The old version of you would have gone to the press. I know. This version is either wiser or considerably more nerve-wracking to work for. Priya said it without heat. I haven't decided which. Both, probably, Victoria said. The elevator opened. Go home, Priya. You've been here since 7. So have you. I know. I'm going soon. She wasn't, but Priya needed to hear it. Priya stepped out, then turned back. For what it's worth, the shareholders you've called this week, 4 of them called me after to say they were voting with the current board. Unprompted. She held the elevator door for a moment. They didn't call because you presented a strong case. They called because they like you. They trust you. A beat. That's not something you built in the last 2 weeks. That's something you built over years without realizing it was happening. The elevator closed. Victoria rode back up to the office alone. The city was dark outside the windows now, the bridge lights and street lights and building lights all doing their collective work against the dark, and she sat in the elevator and felt something that was quieter and more durable than relief. The call with Gerald Finch happened on a Friday morning, 9 days after she'd found his name in the Meridian file. He came alone, which surprised her. She'd expected lawyers. She'd offered the option, left it open, made clear through her assistant that this was an informal conversation with no formal record. He came without lawyers, which told her something. She wasn't sure yet whether it told her he was arrogant or contrite, and she sat across from him in the small conference room she'd chosen specifically because it wasn't her main boardroom. The small one, no view, no power architecture. And she looked at the man she'd terminated 7 years ago. He was 53 now. He'd aged in the particular way that stress aged people. Not in the surface features, but in the set of them, the lines around his eyes that were deeper than they should be at his age, the way he held his shoulders. He looked like a man who'd spent 3 years being certain about something and was now less certain than he'd planned to be. I'm not going to record this, Victoria said. I want you to know that. He looked at her steadily. I know. If you were recording it, you'd have had lawyers here. What I want to know, she said, is whether you actually believe the takeover would be good for the company, or whether this was always only about what happened in 2017. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Both, in the beginning. By the end, it was mostly the second thing. He said it without apparent shame, which she found oddly more honest than if he'd tried to dress it up. You fired me for falsifying compliance reports. You were right to do it. She hadn't expected him to say that. She waited. I was cutting corners because the deal timeline you'd set was impossible, and I didn't know how to tell you that without feeling like I'd failed. So I faked the reports and got caught and spent the next year being certain that the problem was you, not me. He looked up. It's a very comfortable story, very easy to maintain. And Harrington, she said. Harrington had money and a grievance, and no patience for doing the work himself. I had the knowledge, and he stopped. I had the anger. It seemed like a good fit for a while. What changed? Nothing changed. I just got tired of it. He said it without drama, and she believed him, which was the strangest part of the conversation. When Marcus's preliminary contact came through, I felt relief, mostly, which told me something about how I'd been feeling for the last year that I'd been ignoring. Victoria looked at him. She had thought, coming into this room, that she would feel something sharper than what she actually felt. Some version of vindication or residual anger, or at minimum, the clean satisfaction of holding the leverage. Instead, she felt the same quiet tiredness she'd felt when Priya had set Connor Reeves's name on her desk. "I'm not filing the SEC referral," she said. "I'm not going to the press." She paused. "The Harrington position will be withdrawn by end of next week. I'll need your signature on the advisory dissolution before that can happen." He nodded. "You'll have it. And I need you to understand that this isn't absolution. You understand that." "Yes," he said it quietly. "I understand that." She looked at him for a moment longer. "You were good at your job before 2016, she said. "I want you to know that I know that. The decision I had to make in 2017 was the right one, and it was also the hardest personnel decision I made that year. Those two things can both be true." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude. Too complicated for gratitude. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because it's true," she said, "and because I'm tired of people carrying wrong information about themselves because I was too efficient to correct it." She thought about that on the drive home. "Ethan, in the kitchen on Friday at the lake house, I think you're the only one still holding it against yourself." Her father, with his hand on her shoulder for 3 seconds. The long habit of managing everything alone because it was faster, and the specific cost of that speed. She pulled out her phone. "I met with Finch today," she typed. "It went better than I expected. I think I understand something I didn't before about why people do stupid, costly things when they feel they've been failed." His reply came back in a few minutes. "Do you feel sorry for him?" She thought about it. "A little. Is that strange?" "No," he replied. "It means you're seeing him as a person instead of a problem. That's harder and more useful." She looked at that for a moment. Then, "How is Lily?" "Currently conducting a scientific experiment to determine whether a goldfish can be trained to respond to its name. The goldfish is not cooperating." "We're on day 4. "What's the goldfish's name?" "Professor Bubbles." She sat in the car and laughed, and didn't try to do anything with it. The Harrington withdrawal came through on a Thursday. Official, formal, citing strategic portfolio reallocation, in language so neutral it revealed nothing, which was exactly what she'd asked for. By Friday morning, it was a 3-paragraph item in the financial press, unremarkable, the kind of corporate adjustment that appeared and disappeared without traction. Priya sent her a single-word text at 7 that morning. "Clean." Marcus called it 8. "For the record," he said, "I've been practicing corporate law for 19 years, and I've never seen someone choose the quiet path and have it actually work." "It worked because we had the leverage," Victoria said. "The choice was about how to use it, not whether to have it." Still, a pause. "The board is impressed, not just with the outcome, with the approach." "The board doesn't need to be impressed. They need to be confident. There's a difference." "Victoria." His voice had something in it she wasn't accustomed to hearing from Marcus, who was one of the most professionally self-contained people she employed. "You did well. Just let that be true for a minute." She sat with that. "Okay," she said. 1 minute. After the call, she went to the window. Seattle was doing something beautiful and uncharacteristic, genuinely clear, the sky a flat, clean blue that the city only produced a handful of times a year, and the water of the Sound visible between the buildings in strips of silver. She stood at the window and let herself be still for a moment without an agenda. Her phone buzzed. Not Priya, not Marcus. It was a photo from Ethan. No text, just an image. A hand-drawn sign in what was clearly a 7-year-old's handwriting, taped to a fishbowl. The sign read, "Professor Bubbles, genus fish, do not disturb science." The misspellings were perfect. The seriousness of the sign was perfect. The fact that the fish in the bowl appeared to be completely ignoring the entire enterprise was perfect. She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed, "She spelled genius with an I, and I've never related more to a child I haven't met." His response, "She's going to be either a Nobel laureate or a complete disaster. I genuinely cannot tell yet." She thought about the lake house and the dock and basalt rocks in a 7-year-old's hands. She thought about the arrangement. 3 days, $20,000, the careful professional distance she'd built into the contract language. She thought about how none of those structures had actually held, not because either of them had broken them intentionally, but because the structures had been built to keep out something that had simply come in through a different door. She typed, "I'd like to meet her. Lily. If that's something you'd consider, not an arrangement, just, I'd like to meet her." She sent it before she could edit it into something more defended. The response took longer this time. She didn't watch the phone. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and watched the coffee maker do its work, and came back to the desk and picked up the phone. "She already knows about you," Ethan had written. "She asked me who I spent the weekend with. I told her my friend Victoria. She said, and I'm quoting exactly, 'Is she nice, or is she the kind of nice that's actually not that nice?' I said, 'I thought you were the kind of nice that takes a little while to find, but is actually real.' She said okay, and went back to the goldfish. Victoria read it twice. "What did you tell her about the rocks?" she typed. "That a woman named Victoria said the lake had good taste in geology. She said that was a smart thing to say. She means it as the highest possible compliment." Victoria sat at her desk with her coffee and the clean Seattle sky out the window and the aftermath of a battle she'd chosen not to fight the way she used to fight, and she felt, not joy exactly, which always felt to her like a word for something bigger and more consuming than what she generally experienced. Something smaller and more durable. Something that had been building incrementally since a Friday morning 48 hours ago when a man had walked into her penthouse carrying no particular agenda except honesty. She thought about calling her mother. It was 9:30 in the morning on a Friday, and her mother would be on her second cup of coffee, and the call would last 45 minutes and cover 17 unrelated topics before cycling back to whatever Victoria had actually called about. She called. Her mother picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been near the phone, which meant she'd been hoping for this call without being able to say so. "Victoria," she said, "are you okay? You sound different." "I'm okay," Victoria said. "I'm actually okay." A pause. Something happened. A lot of things happened, I'll tell you. She looked out at the water between the buildings. The company is fine. The thing that was threatening it is handled, and she stopped. She thought about how to finish the sentence and found that the cleanest version was also the truest one. "And I think I've been letting the wrong version of myself run things for too long. Not the company, just things." Her mother was quiet in the way that meant she was listening very carefully. "What changed?" "I let someone see the other version," Victoria said. "The one that doesn't have everything under control. And nothing fell apart." Another pause. Longer. "Is this about Ethan?" her mother said. Victoria exhaled. "Mom, I'm just asking." "It's about a lot of things. He's part of it." Her mother made a sound that was not a word but contained an entire sentence, warm and satisfied and self-contained. The sound of a woman who had been waiting a long time for her daughter to say something like this and was going to be gracious enough not to say, "I told you so." "Tell me," her mother said. "I have time." So Victoria told her. Not the managed version, not the curated account with the difficult parts smoothed away. She told her mother about the board fight and the leak and the choice she'd made to go quiet instead of public. She told her about the conversation with Finch and what she'd understood from it. She told her about the texts, the basalt rocks, Professor Bubbles, the 7-year-old's scientific rigor. She talked for 23 minutes without stopping. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to be its own kind of gift. When Victoria finished, her mother said, "You know what I remember most from the lake house?" "What?" "Saturday morning, before your father and I came downstairs. I looked out the upstairs window, and you were on the dock with him, just sitting there, not doing anything, not managing anything." Her voice was careful but steady. "I stood at that window for a few minutes just watching, because I haven't seen you sit still like that, without it costing you something, since before the accident." Victoria was quiet. Maybe longer than that, her mother said. The coffee was cold. The sky was still clear. Somewhere across the city, in a house in Tacoma, a goldfish named Professor Bubbles was declining to respond to its name with great scientific consistency, and a 7-year-old was documenting this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm going to be okay, Mom," Victoria said. "I know," her mother said. "I've always known that. I just wanted you to know it too." 3 months after the lake house weekend, Victoria Hayes did something she had not done in 2 years. She cleared a Saturday. Not partially, not the kind of clearing where she kept the laptop on the kitchen counter and checked her phone between activities and told herself she was resting while her mind ran parallel tracks on quarterly projections. She told Priya on Friday afternoon that her phone would be off from 7 Saturday morning until 7 Saturday evening, and that the only exception was a building fire or a death, and even then she wanted a text first so she could decide whether to respond. Priya had looked at her with the expression she reserved for genuinely unprecedented events. "Okay," she'd said carefully, as if Victoria might take it back. Victoria didn't take it back. She'd agreed to meet Lily at 10. Ethan had proposed it without pressure. That was the thing she kept returning to. He hadn't framed it as a milestone or a test or anything with stakes. He'd texted on a Wednesday. "Lily has a school project about a job she finds interesting. She picked CEO without telling me. Would you be willing to talk to her for 20 minutes? We could come to you or you could come here. No obligation either way." Victoria had stared at the message for longer than 20 minutes should have warranted. It was the no obligation either way that got her. Not because it gave her an exit. She was good at finding exits without being offered them, but because it was so genuinely without agenda. He wasn't engineering an introduction. He wasn't stage managing something. He was a father whose daughter had a school project, asking a reasonable question with a real door left open in both directions. She'd typed back, "I'll come to you Saturday, if that works." Tell her I said CEOs prefer visiting people instead of being visited. It's a power move. His reply. She just said, "Oh," in the tone that means she's writing that down somewhere. She'd smiled at her phone for almost a full minute before she put it down. The house in Tacoma was smaller than she'd pictured, though she wasn't sure why she'd pictured anything specific. A one-story bungalow on a street of similar houses, with a front yard that had seen better maintenance decisions and a porch with 2 mismatched chairs on it and a wind chime that was clearly a child's craft project, painted clay beads on fishing line, mostly intact, one bead missing from the end where it had probably fallen off and been observed with interest, and ultimately not replaced. She sat in the car for a moment after the driver pulled up. This was the part she hadn't prepared for. The lake house had been her territory, her parents', her architecture. This was entirely different. This was a man's real life, the modest and specific life he'd told her about without either apologizing for it or performing pride about it, and she was about to come into it as what, exactly? She hadn't named it. She'd been careful not to name it. The front door opened before she got to the ramp she'd noticed on the left side of the porch. Already there. Already built. The same imperfect edge concrete as her father's, which made her stop for just a second. Lily came through the door at a speed inconsistent with anyone's safety. She was 7, and she was exactly what Victoria had imagined from the texts, and exactly nothing like it at the same time. Small, dark-haired, wearing a shirt that had a diagram of a squid on it with labeled anatomy, which Victoria found immediately and completely correct as a clothing choice. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at Victoria with the specific assessing frankness that only small children and people who'd stopped caring what others thought could pull off. "You're shorter than I thought," Lily said. "Lily!" Ethan's voice came from inside the doorway, a single-word correction delivered with the weariness of a man who had been through this before. "I just meant because Dad said you were powerful," Lily said, with the tone of someone clarifying a factual misunderstanding rather than correcting a social error. "I thought powerful people were taller." "Some of the most powerful people in history were under 5'6", Victoria said. "Napoleon, Carnegie. Cleopatra probably, though the records on that are inconsistent." Lily absorbed this. "Is that true about Cleopatra?" "The records genuinely are inconsistent, which is actually more interesting than a definitive answer." Lily looked at her for another second with that same frank assessment. Then she said, "Okay," and came down the ramp, which she used without hesitation or comment, simply because it was there, and stood next to Victoria's chair and said, "I have 9 questions written down. Dad said I could ask 6. How did you land on 9? I had 12, but some of them he said were personal." Victoria glanced up at the porch. Ethan was leaning in the doorway with the expression of a man trying and mostly failing not to look amused. He lifted a hand in a small wave. She looked back at Lily. "You can ask 8, Victoria said. "Final offer." Lily immediately said, "Deal," with the speed of someone who'd been prepared to negotiate down from 9 and hadn't expected to gain ground. The 8 questions lasted 2 hours. They started on the porch, moved inside when the clouds came, and ended at the kitchen table over grilled cheese that Ethan made with the same absence of fanfare he brought to everything, just appeared from the kitchen with plates and set them down and sat with them while Lily conducted her interview with the seriousness of a professional journalist and the attention span of someone who could, without transition, pivot from "what's the hardest decision you've ever made as a CEO" to "do you think fish have feelings?" and expect both questions to be taken equally seriously. Victoria took both equally seriously. On the fish question specifically, she said she thought the evidence suggested fish had something that functioned like stress response, but that consciousness was a genuinely contested philosophical area, and she wasn't going to pretend a certainty she didn't have. Lily had nodded and written something down and then said, "I think Professor Bubbles has feelings because he looks different when I come in the room than when Dad comes in the room." "What does different look like?" "More interested," Lily said. "Dad thinks I'm imagining it, but I've been observing for 3 weeks." 3 weeks is a reasonable observational sample, Victoria said. "Document it. If you have data, you have an argument." Lily looked at Ethan with the specific expression of a child who has just received external validation for an ongoing domestic dispute. Ethan pointed at Victoria. "Don't encourage the fish science." "The fish science sounds rigorous to me." "The fish science is why I've bought 3 logbooks in the last month." Victoria looked at him. He was trying to be stern about it and couldn't quite hold the line. She found, sitting in his kitchen with a grilled cheese and a 7-year-old's research journal open on the table, that the stern attempt was one of the most appealing things she'd observed in recent memory. It was a real face. Not managed. Just a man in his own kitchen, in his own life, slightly undermined by his daughter's scientific ambitions. After lunch, Lily went to retrieve the rock collection from the lake, which had been assigned a dedicated shelf in what Ethan called the nature corner of Lily's room, and which Lily called the science station. Ethan and Victoria sat at the kitchen table while the sounds of a 7-year-old conducting an excavation came from the hallway. "She liked you," Ethan said. Not as a reassurance, just as a fact. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said, and meant it without qualification. "She's a lot," he agreed, in the best and also sometimes the most exhausting way. "She asks better questions than half my board." He smiled at that, the real smile, the one where the careful neutrality dropped away completely. "Don't tell her that. She'll start charging consulting fees." They sat in a comfortable silence that had become, over the past 3 months of intermittent texts and 2 phone calls and 1 lunch that had lasted 3 hours without either of them commenting on the time, their natural register with each other. Victoria had stopped finding the silence strange. She'd started finding it necessary, in the way that certain things become necessary once you've discovered you've been living without them. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "The second payment." She'd thought about how to say this for a while and had decided the direct route was the only one that felt honest. "I transferred it the Monday after the lake house, but I want to—" She stopped. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like I'm renegotiating something that's already done." "Try," he said. "I want to give it back," she said. "Not because the arrangement wasn't real, not because you didn't earn it. You did, and more than that. But because it changed into something else during those 3 days. And I've been carrying the money as a category that no longer fits what happened, and I'd rather—" She pressed her lips together. "I'd rather start from a place that isn't a transaction, if that's something you're willing to consider." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table, then at her. "Lily's school year ends in June. he said. The house situation. The mortgage. The 20,000 was the difference between stable and not stable. You knew that when you offered it. I know. So giving it back isn't actually something I can do in a way that doesn't have consequences. I know that too. She held his gaze. Keep the money. I don't mean literally give it back. I mean, she exhaled. I mean, I want to stop thinking of you as someone I paid to show up. Because you weren't by the end of it. And maybe not even at the beginning. He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for Lily's ongoing excavation in the hallway and the specific sound of a logbook being consulted. For what it's worth, he said, I stopped thinking of myself that way about halfway through Friday dinner. When my father told the raccoon story. When you smiled at the raccoon story and thought nobody was watching. He said it simply, without loading it with significance. You looked like a completely different person for about 30 seconds. I thought, there she is. That's who's actually in there. Victoria looked at the kitchen table. The grain of it, the small stain near the corner that hadn't come fully out, the slight unevenness where two boards met. A table that had been lived with, not displayed. I've spent a long time, she said, making sure the person in there stays in there, where it's safe. I know, he said. I've been watching you practice it. Does that make it hard? She wasn't sure what she was asking. She asked it anyway. He thought about it in the way he thought about real things, actually considered it, didn't reach for the easy answer. No, he said. It makes it significant when it comes out. The 30-second version on Friday, the version on the dock Sunday morning, the version that apparently exists when a 7-year-old confirms that Professor Bubbles has scientifically observable feelings. He paused. I'd rather see the real version sometimes than a performed version all the time. She looked at him. You're not afraid of the work of it, she said. Not a question. I raised a kid alone for 3 years, he said. I know what actual hard looks like. This isn't hard. This is just two people figuring something out without a good map. He shrugged slightly. I'm a history teacher. I'm comfortable with things that don't have clean narratives. From the hallway, Lily's voice. I found the 3 lake rocks and also a shark tooth from the museum that somehow got in here. I didn't know that was in there. Ethan called back. That's from the Natural History Museum trip in February. I told you not to put it with the regular rocks. They're all rocks. A shark tooth is not a rock, Lily. It's a hard natural object, Lily said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. Victoria put her hand over her mouth. Ethan pointed at her. Do not laugh. It encourages her. She laughed. She couldn't help it. It came out real and unguarded and slightly inelegant, the way real laughter usually was. And Ethan watched it happen with an expression she was only now learning to read. Something open. Something that had stopped trying to be careful. She stayed until 4:30, longer than she'd planned and exactly as long as it turned out to be needed. Lily showed her the lake rocks on their dedicated shelf, explained the basalt identification process with the aid of the internet research Ethan had done that Sunday night, and then pivoted to showing Victoria the scientific log. 3 weeks of careful, misspelled documentation of Professor Bubbles' behavioral patterns, with hand-drawn graphs that were charming and not especially accurate but demonstrated a commitment to methodology that Victoria found genuinely impressive. She told Lily that, directly, without softening it into something more childproof. Lily looked at her with that assessing directness and said, Most adults don't actually read it. They just say it's nice. I read it, Victoria said. Your sample size is good. Your graph labels need work. Dad says the same thing about the graph labels. Your dad is right about the graph labels. Lily looked at Ethan with the specific expression of a child recalibrating an alliance. Ethan raised his eyebrows at Victoria in a way that said, You've made your choice, and you'll have to live with it. When the driver came at 4:30, Lily walked her to the porch without being asked, carrying the ramp navigation with the same matter-of-fact ease she'd shown all afternoon. No commentary, no performance of sensitivity, just a kid moving through her own house with a person who moved differently than she did, and finding no particular reason to make it into a thing. At the porch edge, Lily said, For the school project, I'm going to say the most important part of being a CEO is knowing which decisions to make yourself and which ones to let other people help with. Is that right? Victoria considered it seriously. That's more right than most things adults say about it. Lily nodded, satisfied. Then, in the same tone and without transition, "Are you going to come back?" The directness of it landed simply. No artifice, no social cushioning. A 7-year-old who wanted a real answer to a real question. "Yes," Victoria said, "if that's okay with you." Lily looked at her for a second. "It's okay with me," she said, and went back inside with the same efficient energy she'd come out with, the screen door swinging behind her. Ethan was at the top of the ramp. He walked down it and stood beside the car, and they were at eye level in the particular way that she'd noticed he arranged himself without announcing it. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "She did most of the work." "She did. You raise someone who does most of the work." She paused. "That's not an accident." He looked at her in that way he had, the direct, unperformed attention that had unsettled her the first time she'd encountered it, and that she now thought of as one of the most specific and irreplaceable things about him. "Same time works, 2 weeks from now?" "There's a natural history exhibit at the Science Center she's been asking about. She'd probably invite you herself, but she's 7 and hasn't learned yet that you can just ask people things directly." She seemed pretty willing to ask people things directly to me. She got comfortable fast. He said it simply. "She doesn't do that with everyone." Victoria looked at him. She thought about the 4 months of Daniel, carefully constructed in the empty space where a real person should have been. She thought about the arrangement and the transfer and the 72 hours at the lake house that had been supposed to solve a specific problem and had instead rearranged something she hadn't known was up for rearrangement. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks. She got in the car. She didn't watch him go back up the porch steps, but she thought about it all the way back to Seattle. The image of him standing beside the ramp he hadn't built, but that was there because Lily lived in this house, and this house had to work for people who came into it, and the entire quiet thoughtfulness of that detail that he'd never once mentioned. The Science Center trip happened, and then a dinner. Just the 3 of them. A diner in Tacoma that Lily had strong opinions about because it had both good pie and a dessert menu that arrived on a laminated card shaped like a slice of pie, which Lily considered evidence of institutional integrity. And then a Sunday afternoon at Victoria's apartment, which Lily approached with the quiet reverence of someone trying to take in a large amount of data without appearing overwhelmed, walking through the rooms with her hands clasped behind her back like a very small museum visitor. "You have a lot of windows," Lily said. "I like the light," Victoria said. "It's good for plants," Lily said. "You should have plants." "I kill plants. I'll help you pick ones that are harder to kill." Lily said it with complete confidence, the confidence of a person who'd decided this was now her responsibility. "There's a succulent at the school fair next month." "I'll be there," Victoria said, and meant it. She told her mother about the succulent fair on a Tuesday call, and her mother was quiet for a second and then said, "You're going to a school fair," in a voice that held an entire continent of feeling inside one sentence. "Don't make it more than it is," Victoria said. "I'm not making it anything," her mother said. "I'm just—" A pause. "I used to sit up some nights after the accident. Your father would be asleep, and I'd sit up and I'd think about you in that apartment by yourself, managing everything. And I'd think, she's going to be okay. She's capable of more than anyone. But I want more for her than okay. I want her to have this, whatever this is." Her voice was steady. She was a woman who expressed love through action and attention rather than grand declaration, which meant that when she reached for declaration, it landed differently. "I just want you to know I see it, the change, and I'm glad." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The Seattle sky outside the window was doing the gray to gold thing that happened on spring evenings when the sun found an angle through the clouds. "Me too," she said. Bad. On the last day of May, Ethan drove to the lake house. Not a planned trip. He'd called her on a Friday afternoon and said Lily was at his sister's for the night, and he was driving north because he needed to think, and he'd ended up on the road to the lake before he'd consciously decided on a destination, and he'd called to see if she'd want to meet him there. She'd said yes before he finished asking. She was there before him. She'd had the car service and a shorter commute from Seattle, and she sat on the dock in the early evening light waiting, watching the lake do its unhurried thing. The heron was at the south bank. She'd seen it the moment she arrived, the way you saw it if you knew where to look. He came down the path 20 minutes after she'd arrived, and he sat on the dock beside her the same way he had in April, legs over the edge, and they both looked at the lake for a while. "Lily asked me if you were my girlfriend," he said. Victoria kept her eyes on the water. "What did you say?" I said I wasn't sure how to answer that. What did she say? She said that was a very confusing answer and I should figure it out. Solid advice. "She's 7, he said. "She sees things pretty clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to figure it out. I wanted to be honest with you about where I am. I'm not the kind of person who moves fast because it feels good. I have a daughter, and that means anything I do matters in a direction beyond just me." "I know that," Victoria said. "I've known that since the first conversation." "And you're still here." "I'm still here." He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing something generous to the lake and the tree line in his face, though she was aware enough of her own tendency toward managed thinking to note that she'd have found his face worth looking at in less forgiving light. "I didn't fall in love with the version of you that's on the magazine covers," he said. "I want you to know that. Not because that version isn't real. It is. It's part of you. But it's not the part that makes me drive 3 hours on a Friday night because I want to sit on a dock." She looked at the water. "What part does that?" "The part that deleted 4 messages before she sent me the honest one. The part that told her father the truth she'd been protecting for 2 years. The part that chose to let Finch walk away without burning him down, even though she could have." He paused. "The part that asked my 7-year-old if her scientific methodology was sound and meant it as a real question." Victoria was quiet. The heron lifted from the south bank and crossed the lake in that slow, improbable way herons had. Too large for the air, but moving through it anyway with total conviction. "I'm not easy," she said. It came out simply, which was how she'd learned to say true things since the lake house. "I work too much, and I manage things that don't need to be managed, and I sometimes turn emotional situations into logistics problems before I've noticed I'm doing it." "I know," he said. "You're also one of the most honest people I've met once you stop managing. You're good, genuinely good, even when it costs you something, and you show up." He paused. "That last one matters more than people say it does." She turned to look at him. "Lily's right," she said. "You should figure it out." Something in his face shifted. "Yeah," he said. "I think I have." The lake held the evening light the way lakes did, taking it in, giving nothing back, entirely itself. The heron was gone. The water was flat and dark and deep, the way it got when the sun went low. Behind them, the lake house held its familiar smell of cedar and old fires and her father's imperfect mortar, 30 years of summers laid into the walls. He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just reached over and held it, the way you held on to something that mattered without needing to announce that it mattered. She didn't move away. She didn't manage it into something smaller or safer or more bounded. She let it be what it was, sitting on a dock in the last light with a man who had walked into her apartment 4 months ago without an agenda and stayed, somehow, without her quite deciding to let him, until he was simply part of the way she understood her own life. This was not a story about a woman who got rescued. She had built the company. She had found the leak. She had chosen the quiet path in the boardroom and made it work. She had called her father back. She had built all of that herself, and she would keep building it, imperfectly, with the specific stubbornness that had gotten her this far and would carry her the rest of the way. But there was a difference. She knew this now in a way she hadn't before the lake house, between building alone because you had to and building alone because you'd forgotten that was a choice. She'd been doing the second thing for a long time, mistaking endurance for strength, mistaking isolation for control. She was still learning the difference. She expected she'd be learning it for a while. That was okay. The dock creaked slightly in the evening quiet. The water moved in small, unhurried patterns. Somewhere across the lake a bird called once and went silent, and the sound of it spread out and dissolved the way all sounds eventually did, leaving the lake exactly as it had been. "Lily's going to want to come next time," Ethan said. "I know. She'll want to check if the heron is documented in the logbook. It's not." Then we have a gap in the data, Victoria said. She'll need to fix that. He was quiet for a second. We, he said, not making it significant, just noting it. We, she said. They sat on the dock until the light was gone, and the lake was dark, and the stars came out over the water, in the particular abundance that was only possible this far from the city, and neither of them was in a hurry to go anywhere, and that was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough. It was the whole thing.